Hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Friday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first, we've got the hazardous weather graphic up here, and there's a coastal flood warning this evening for the north coast of the Seward Peninsula into Kotzebue Sound, as well as the northwest coast up to about Point Hope or Cape Lisburne, and that's due to end, I believe, at 7 p.m. this evening, and then it's out through the night tonight for the western and central Arctic coast. Again, coastal flood warning there throughout the night tonight and should end by 6 a.m. Saturday morning. Otherwise, high surf advisory for this evening for St. Lawrence Island and the Norton Sound area, Yukon Delta coast, up in toward the Bering Strait coast as well. And that's for heavy surf and possible minor beach erosion. And that's through this evening. And then the other area there that's highlighted in yellow, that's a wind advisory for Saturday and Saturday night for the Alaska Range there, mostly west of the Toad Cutoff. And that's for south winds of 30 to 40 miles an hour, expected to increase, sustained 30 to 40 miles an hour with gusts to 65 miles per hour, again through the passes there. And that's for Saturday and Saturday night. And moving on to satellite imagery, you can see a lot of clouds streaming across the Bering Sea. Next system there, spreading rain into the central Aleutians, up toward the Pribilof Islands with the warm front there. And then clouds over southern Alaska and up across the eastern interior, kind of shifting eastward as well, as you can see here, kind of drying out, but then more clouds coming into the southwest coast. And mostly sunny over the central southern panhandle, or mostly sunny over the southern panhandle, partly sunny in the central areas there, and then mostly cloudy after the morning, low clouds and fog there in the north. And along the coast, pretty cloudy this afternoon, but the sunshine down south, especially Prince of Wales Island and well across the southern interior. A lot of temperatures rising in the 60s to lower 70s in some locations by 3 o'clock this afternoon. Shelter Cove at 72 degrees, Klawock 65 degrees. Very nice October temperatures there. And mostly in the 50s across south central Alaska today, and then cooler up to the north. And rolling this through again, we'll see on today's chart, front bringing moderate amounts of rain to the North Gulf Coast today. For example, Cordova, 12-hour period ending at mid-afternoon, picked up about 1 3/4 inches of precipitation, and that was kind of a standout amount there, lighter elsewhere, but about 1/4 of an inch up into the Copper River, southeastern Copper River Basin, with areas of light rain up across the Alaska Range and then over the eastern interior. And some moisture into the Koyukuk Valley, with Bettles picking up 1/4 of an inch of rain, while Beaver had about 1/3 of an inch of precipitation. Pretty gusty winds out of the west-southwest along the western Arctic coast. Atasuk seeing a gust to 40 miles per hour during the day today. And windy condition extended down to the Seward Peninsula with both, and into Kotzebue, about 30 miles an hour west-southwest winds gusting 30 miles an hour both at Kotzebue and Nome during the afternoon hours. And Anchorage State Airport had south winds gusting to 30 miles an hour this afternoon. Otherwise, lighter winds elsewhere around southern Alaska. Not much of a gradient, just enough to keep those winds going out of western Turnagain Arm and cutting across West Anchorage. Next system brought some rain into the Aleutians there. Light rain, fog, drizzle, IFR flying conditions spreading up into the Pribilofs. And for tonight, you'll see that system kind of splits two separate lows there. One develops over Nunivak Island, another one moving to the Alaska Peninsula, cutting across or just north of the eastern Aleutians, with the warm front spreading rain into Bristol Bay, Shelikof Strait, and into the southern Kuskokwim Valley, with areas of rain and somewhat lighter winds across south central Alaska, Cook Inlet, Kenai Peninsula, showers over the eastern and north Gulf Coast into the northern Panhandle, and then some rain continues possibly in the mid and upper Tanana Valley, Some of that could be mixed with snow higher elevations back toward the Yukon River, and also some rain and snow showers possible over the northwest interior with diminishing winds all areas there. Still a little breezy over the eastern Arctic coast, and winds on the increase for the eastern Aleutians. And that whole pattern will shift eastward after the increase in the winds later tonight for the Fox Islands. They'll decrease, but increase across the Alaska Peninsula. Could see gusts anywhere from 30 to possibly as high as 45 plus miles per hour there for the Alaska Peninsula tomorrow. That low tracking up into northeast Bristol Bay, and a warm front will spread moisture northward and somewhat milder air in across the central western Alaska range. Gusty winds pick up again out of the southeast and south across the Kenai Peninsula, Cook Inlet, and locally up into the Matanuska Valley with rain, moderate to heavy at times, from Kodiak, southern coast of the Kenai Peninsula, western Prince William Sound. Lighter amounts of rain along the eastern North Gulf Coast, and then becoming showery. A little more in the way of clouds and showers over the southern panhandle, but not too much precipitation over the southern areas. And stays dry for the North Slope and the Arctic coast, with most of the moisture backed up along the Brooks Range. And then for the day on Sunday, next system pushes east-northeastward into the southern Bering Sea, just north of Adak and Atka, 981 millibar low there, with gale force winds and rain, especially along the frontal boundary there. Showers for the western Aleutians, rain spreading east-northeastward into the Pribilof Islands during the morning hours, not reaching the southwest coast though, but rain will increase. Chances of will increase for the Alaska Peninsula, and storm force winds out of the west and northwest in store for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, with gales for Kodiak Island there. But that northwest wind will dry it out. Look for a fair amount of clearing and drier conditions. Bristol Bay into the southwest interior, dry over all of the western interior. Rain and snowfall levels falling to about 2,000 feet across south central Alaska on Sunday, with areas of rain or rain and snow mixed as you head north, with mostly snow from the Brooks Range of the eastern Arctic coast, and that cold front spreads rain across much of the panhandle, turning more showery on the central coast in the afternoon. Lows for tonight, mid-40s to lower 50s for the southeast coast, otherwise mostly in the 40s, south central Alaska, Copper River Basin, near 50 for Kodiak, 30s for the Kuskokwim Valley. Highs for tomorrow, 55 to 60 southern southeast coast, or actually in the mid to upper 50s for the highs, all of the panhandle. Lower to mid 50s south central Alaska, Copper River Basin, Kodiak Island, near 50 in Bristol Bay. 40s for the Kuskokwim Valley. Lows mid 30s Kodiak, and lower 30s Bristol Bay into the Kuskokwim Valley as the colder air comes in. And lower 40s across south central Alaska, Susitna Valley, Copper River Basin, and lows in the 50s for the panhandle, followed by highs upper 50s to near 60, especially around Sitka for the southeast coast, and upper 30s to near 40 for the Kuskokwim Valley, otherwise 40s to near 50 elsewhere. Up north, lows in the 20s and 30s, followed by highs in the 30s and 40s to near 50 around North Pole and Northway, and then lows back in the 20s to lower 30s, followed by highs in the 30s to lower 40s, so a little cooler on Sunday afternoon. Out west, 30s and 40s for the lows, followed by highs in the 40s to mid-50s, and lows back in the 30s to lower 40s, followed by highs near 40 along the southwest coast, mid-50s central.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather, VFR there from the Yukon River up across eastern Brooks Range, North Slope Arctic coast. Start the day out VFR with VFR flying conditions. IFR there, Yukon Delta, southwestward to the Pribilofs, and then south across eastern Aleutians, covering much of the Alaska Peninsula, on up across Shelikof Strait, Kodiak Island, and eastern slopes of the western Alaska Range. IFR for the North Gulf Coast, Resurrection Bay into Turnagain Arm, eastward to Yakutat, some more IFR over the southern Panhandle. And for the afternoon, for Saturday, IFR, Bristol Bay, Kuskokwim Valley, Kuskokwim Delta, up to the lower Yukon River Valley there, eastern Yukon Delta, another branch extending up toward the Yukon Flats there into the Koyukuk Valley. North of the Brooks Range, VFR to the central to eastern Arctic coast, and the eastern interior, upper Tanana Valley, part of the Copper River Basin, eastern Alaska Range, VFR, and becoming VFR over the southern Panhandle, increasing marginal VFR elsewhere there, and another batch of IFR coming into Kiska, Shimianatu. And for Sunday morning, that area advances eastward almost to Atka Island, and VFR shifts into the Pribilofs and the Fox Islands, western Alaska Peninsula, and also pretty good over the western interior, with VFR flying, IFR in the central interior, back to VFR for the mid and upper Tanana Valley, southeast Yukon Flats area, and marginal VFR for the Panhandle to Yakutat, IFR North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, across the Talkeetnas into the Susitna Valley, and then for Sunday afternoon, IFR advancing eastward there, strong westerly flow, pushing it across the Pribilofs by midday into the eastern Aleutians, approaching Falls Pass late in the afternoon, with good VFR, northern Bering Sea, Bering Strait coast, Seward Peninsula, actually Kotzebue, much of the western interior south of the Brooks Range to Bristol Bay and the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak, all looking really good for Sunday afternoon. Eastern interior, good area of IFR there from the eastern Arctic coast down to the Alaska Range. Also the eastern North Gulf Coast, all of the Panhandle looking to be pretty much IFR. And for passes, Anatuvik and Adigan for the day Saturday, mostly marginal at times. And for Lake Clark and Merrill, looks like IFR flying conditions, both passes there. And for rainy, IFR as well. Up to windy, IFR southern entrance, marginal VFR through the pass, and out the north side becoming VFR. Isabel, marginal VFR, but VFR on the northern approach, or to the north there. And for Mentasta, VFR with marginal VFR possible on the southern entrance. Tanita, IFR possible on the eastern entrance. That's where the lowest flying conditions should be, otherwise marginal VFR. Portage, IFR, and Chilcoot and White, marginal VFR. Looking at the freezing levels at the surface over the central Brooks Range to the eastern Arctic coast, 2,000 feet back down but still north of the Pribilofs, and then quite a thermal gradient there across the southern Bering Sea and the Aleutians, supporting pretty good jet across the Bering Sea there, and anywhere from 10 to 12,000 feet over the Panhandle. Icing, areas of isolated moderate rime icing from Bristol Bay, Alaska Peninsula, pushing eastward into south central Alaska, and much of the interior has icing potential tomorrow, mostly above 7,000 feet. Then a couple of zones, one out over the Aleutians above about 4,000 feet, just very isolated, moderate, possibly, as well as the northern Bering Sea there to St. Lawrence Island. And for the jet stream, good westerly flow across the central southern Bering Sea, just north of the Aleutians, up to 150 knots there, right across the Fox Islands. Southwest flow, 90 to 115 knots, western interior to the eastern Arctic coast. And coming down to 9,000 feet, 60 to 70 knots southerlies there from the Barren Islands right up across the Kenai Peninsula, and western Copper River Basin, 55 knots there across the upper Tanana Valley, 40-mile country, and then westerlies of 45 knots out over the Bering Sea. 3,000 feet, 55-knot northwesterlies across the Alaska Peninsula and Aleutian Range, swinging around to south-southeast, 55 knots right into Prince William Sound. Winds on the increase on the central north coast of the Panhandle, but pretty light and variable over interior Alaska. And then you can see the next storm southwest of the western Aleutians. Turbulence, widespread, considerable moderate chop, Alaska Range, Copper River Basin, and Madanuska Valley, as well as Kodiak Island to Unalaska Island.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Carrie.haisley, Chief of the Emergency Services and Multimedia Branch for the National Weather Service in Anchorage. With me today I have Dr. Doug Wesley, a physical scientist for the National Weather Service Alaska Region Headquarters. Doug, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Carrie. Hello.
Hello. So you're here to talk to us a little bit about something called CocoRUS, which is the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. And I understand that CocoRUS is a network of volunteers who take weather observations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what CocoRUS is?
Yes, it began in the lower 48, 20 some years ago, and it's expanded during those 2 decades. They're getting something like 10 to 15,000 rainfall reports per day from the lower 48.
Wow, that's a lot of different reports. So how many reports do we get in Alaska right now?
Well, it varies maybe 10 to 25. But if you consider the large areas we're talking about, we have a lot of gaps to fill. Any observation is better than no observation, but there are large areas in Alaska. Alaska covers 3 million square miles. There's a lot of data gaps in that space, so we'd like to enhance it.
Sure. So tell us then a bit about why these observations are so important to Alaska and why we need to expand the number of them that we're getting.
Yes, Alaska, as you know, has large areas with a lot of complex terrain, and there are no weather observing stations or radar. So CoCoRaHS can help fill the data gaps, so you can at least get some idea of what's actually falling from the sky at those locations. CoCoRaHS increases the amount of timely weather observations available to meteorologists and other decision makers, especially in hazardous type of weather, both rain and snow and the occasional hailstorm that we get up here. CoCoRaHS observations can help forecasters identify long-term precipitation and snowfall trends in a climate sense. And just overall, they increase the amount of timely weather observations available to the public.
So then let's talk a little bit about each of the different types of observations. So it's the rain, hail, and snow network. So let's start by talking a little bit about rain observations and tell us a little bit about how you take those and how long it takes a volunteer to get a rain observation.
Okay, this is a 4-inch gauge, just the basic gauge, which you use for both rain and snowfall. But the rain observations are pretty quick. It's a matter of 2 or 3 minutes that each volunteer goes out and takes a reading, and then they enter these on the computer, and they're immediately available for observation on the computer and on the maps, so that you can see your report. In the wintertime, it's a little bit more complicated. We require the observers to measure not only the snow accumulation, but also liquid equivalent. So they've got to melt the snowfall. This involves 2 of these gauges and a snowboard. And it's maybe a 10-minute observation per day during the winter. But the snowfall is so variable that even across town and in especially the remote areas, it's crucial that we increase this number of snow observations in the network.
Right. I understand that we can only take observations in places where we have weather service offices. And so we rely on all of these volunteers to help us fill gaps. And it's also interesting to know how snowfall varies across like large spaces or even small cities. So I notice here in Anchorage, for example, we can have a vastly different amount of snow on the east side of town and the west side of town. And so it seems like these observations would help us to better understand what's going on in places besides just where the office is.
That's correct. In any given snowfall, there are typically large variances, as you know, and we rely on reports from the public and from National Weather Service cooperative spotters to map out the snowfall that occurs so that we can predict it better in the future.
Sure. So we talked about rain observations and we talked about snow observations. And you said for each of those, if it's rain, it only takes a couple minutes and then it can take about 10 minutes if it's snow. Hail was the other one that we didn't talk about yet. Tell us just a little bit about the hail observations that CoCoRaHS observers take.
Yeah, the CoCoRaHS network, it has a hail pad, and it's just a simple block of styrofoam covered with aluminum foil, and you can approximate the size of hail by measuring the dent that the hail causes on the pad. And this can give us an estimate of hail size. We don't get hail very often in Alaska, but I've seen it 2 or 3 times in my 5 years in Anchorage, and some of it up to a ½ inch. And I'm sure there's been larger hail up in the interior at times.
So let's talk a little bit about how these rain, hail, and snow observations can help forecasters. So we have people who forecast the weather, and we also have people who work on the hydrology side, and I can see that maybe CoCoRaHS will be beneficial to both of them. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, it's beneficial to the hydrologic forecaster who's concerned about flooding, and rainfall comprises one of the causes of a flood, or it can exacerbate high water conditions. So the more the hydrologist has to look at in terms of data from recent rainfall, the more information they have to work with when they're generating a forecast. The weather forecasters in the wintertime at the Weather Service office can use these observations also to help with past case studies, to verify model data, and to get a handle on what's actually happening out the window. And that's important in the forecast process.
Yeah, it seems like you can never have too much information when you're issuing a forecast. So it only takes a few minutes most of the time to take these observations. So let's say I'm interested in becoming a volunteer for CocoRa's. How do I get involved?
Yeah, the website is very useful, cocoras.org, and it has a number of video-based training tutorials that take you right on from measuring rainfall to a video tutorial on measuring snowfall. It has the maps available in real time, and you can go back and look at that old data too through those maps. And so it's a very useful, comprehensive website.
Very interesting. And anybody can get involved, right? You don't have to be a meteorologist.
That's right. And, we love to have 24, once a day reports throughout the year. But if you can't, then so be it. And we have observers. Some observers are out of town for periods of time, or maybe they can only report a week or two of precipitation, but it's still useful. It's still data that we look at. So the more the better, but you can get involved even if you aren't at a location 24/7.
Doug, I really appreciate you coming on to our program today to talk about CocoRa's. Hopefully we can have you back in the studio at some point so we can talk more about it, and then talk more about the different types of observations and the tools that observers use.
That would be great. Yeah.
So thank you for your time, and thank you so much for joining this edition of Alaska Weather Facts.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to the coastal water forecast for the south coast, south winds 20 to 25 knots. And for the north coast, east-southeast winds at 25 knots with 8-foot seas. Northern inner channels, Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, south winds 20 knots, southeast at 20 for Stevens Passage, and just south at 10 for Clarence Strait. And for the second day of the weekend, Sunday, we've got small craft advisories along the coast, gale warnings for Lynn Canal for south winds at 35 knots, small craft advisory Stevens Passage for south winds 25 knots, Clarence Strait will see south winds at 20 knots. And for the south coast, we've got south to southwest winds 25 to 30 knots and west-southwest at 30 knots for the north coast with 14-foot seas. Prince William Sound for Saturday, southeast winds 30 knots, seas 7 feet. North Gulf Coast, southeast winds 30 knots, seas around 10 feet, and 25 knot south winds for the Barren Islands, southeast 25 for Kamishak Bay, southern Cook Inlet east at 20, northern Cook Inlet southeast at 10. And for Sunday, northwest winds 15 knots for northern Cook Inlet, small craft advisory south of the Forelands, northwest at 30 knots with 7-foot seas. Storm warnings for Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands for west winds of 50 knots with 15 to 20-foot seas. Gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast, west winds 40 to 45 knots. And Prince William Sound, northwest winds 20 knots, higher gusts out of western bays with 4-foot seas. Kodiak Island, gale warnings, south winds 35 knots. Alaska Peninsula, gale warnings, west to northwest winds 30 to 35 knots for Saturday. And for the Alaska Peninsula, variable winds 30 knots, seas 6 feet. Those will go from variable to west at 30 knots for Bristol Bay on Sunday with 11-foot seas. Alaska Peninsula, west winds 20 knots, 7 to 10-foot seas. Gale warnings for Kodiak Island, west winds 35 to 45 knots, higher gusts with seas as high as 17 feet. Eastern Aleutians for the day Saturday, northwest winds 25 to 35 knots with 8 to 11-foot seas. Central Aleutians, northwest 20 to 25 knots, variable winds 15 knots for the western Aleutians. And for Sunday, storm warnings for the western Aleutians, west winds 50 to 55 knots. And for the central Aleutians, gales and storms there as well, with southwest winds at 40 to 50 knots. And gale warnings for the eastern Aleutians. Southwest winds 35 to 45 knots with seas running 17 to 33 feet. For the Pribilofs on Saturday, northwest winds 30 knots, seas just under 10 feet, northwest at 30 for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, Yukon Delta coast north at 25, St. Lawrence and St. Matthew Islands, northwest winds 20 knots. And for Norton Sound, winds will be on the light side by comparison, south at 15 knots with 3-foot seas. On Sunday, Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island, west winds 20 knots, 4 to 6-foot seas there. Gale warnings for the Yukon Delta coast, south winds at 35 knots with 9-foot seas, and 40 knots southwest winds for the Kuskokwim Delta coast. Gale warnings also for the Pribilof, south winds 40 knots, seas 24 feet. Gale warnings St. Matthew Island, east winds at 35 knots. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast for Saturday, south winds 10 to 15 knots, and for the central and west side, southwest winds 15 to 20 knots. West-southwest, 10 to 15 knots from Wales to Cape Beaufort. And on Sunday, west winds 20 to 25 knots for the central and western Arctic coast, all the way down to Wales. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, north to northwest winds at 20 knots, seas at around 4 feet. And for the forecast for tonight, things winding down up there from St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait and the western Arctic coastal areas, with coastal flood warnings out for most of the night for the western and central Arctic coast, ending this evening elsewhere. Rain with a warm front, Bristol Bay into the southern Kuskokwim Valley, areas of rain across southern Alaska and the North Gulf Coast especially, with diminishing south winds, but they won't end completely. Scattered showers into the northern panhandle. For tomorrow, increase in the wind and rain again for the Kenai Peninsula, south central Alaska, North Gulf Coast, especially the western North Gulf Coast, and Kodiak Island. Gusty northwest winds 30 to 50 miles an hour for the Alaska Peninsula, maybe some sun breaks for the eastern Aleutians. Next storm comes rolling into the southern Bering Sea during the day Sunday with gale force winds and rain, and storm warnings for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.